to the first session of Educational's Digital Future here in Winter Quarter. I would like to, my name is Candace Till, and I'm new faculty here in the Graduate School of Education. And I'd like to thank the Graduate School of Education, in particular our Dean, Claude Steele, for making these sessions possible. I'm one of the co-conveners of Education's Digital Future, and my other co-convener is Mitchell Stevens. And tonight we're going to be talking about teaching and learning as complex systems. And in order to discuss this, we've brought together experts from three different fields: a philosopher of science, a psychologist, and a computer scientist. And I will tell you a little bit more about each of our speakers. So our first speaker is Sandra Mitchell. She's professor and chair of the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. Previously, she served on the faculty at Ohio State University and the University of California, San Diego. Her research focuses on scientific investigations of complex systems, hence why she fits so well here, including explanations of the division of labor in social insects, genetic contribution to psychiatric disorders, climate change, and protein folding. She is the author of Biological Complexity and Integrative Pluralism and Unsimple Truths, Science, Complexity, and Policy, which is available in the Stanford bookstore. In paperback, now, for the first time. She currently serves on the Scientific Program Committee of the AAAS. Then we also have our own James McClelland, who is the Lucy Stern Professor in the Social Sciences and the founding director of the Center for the Mind, Brain, and Computation at Stanford. Previously, he served on the faculty of the University of California at San Diego. It's a pattern. And before he moved to Carnegie Mellon, where he was the founding director of the Center for the Basis of Neural Cognition, which was a joint project between Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh. So our two first speakers had multiple opportunities in their professional career to intersect, but actually this is the first time they've met. He currently teaches psychology in the psychology department and the symbolic systems program at Stanford, and conducts research applying neural network models to understand how we learn to think using mathematical concepts. His work has been recognized by many honors, including membership in the National Academy of Sciences. And our third speaker, our computer scientist, is John Mitchell, who is the Mary and Gordon Crary Family Professor in the School of Engineering. He's a professor of computer science, and by courtesy, a professor of electrical engineering and education. In August 2012, John became Stanford's first vice provost of online learning. Since the 1990s, John's primary research interests were related to computer privacy, security, and web technology. In 2009, John's group built a web platform for teaching that supported online discussion, flipped classroom, experiments, and the enthusiasm on campus that launched Udacity and Coursera. So I'd like to join me in welcoming our speakers.
Well, thank you, Candace and Mitchell and the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. I'm delighted to be here. My work, as Candace pointed out, has been looking at how the studies of complex structures has changed the way we think about science, how we think about what nature is like, how we think about how we learn about nature, the experimental and other methods we can use to study complexity. And also more recently, how we can use what we can learn about complex systems to make good policies, for example, in things like climate change. But what I want to talk about today is an issue that has to do with some parallel movements. My own research has been primarily in looking at biology, and there's been a movement in biology known as evidence-based medicine that might be...
We want to make sure your microphone is turned on so we can get every morsel of what you're saying. Okay. Can you check the other? Can you switch on the other one too?
Hello. Oh, that works.
Good. Okay.
Is that working? I can hear it. All right. All right. Well, that was the entertaining part of this lecture. But there's been these movements since the 90s to take more practical parts of scientific activities like clinical medicine, like teaching in the classrooms, and to suggest that they need to be more responsive and informed by evidence. Now, some people responded to these movements in both these domains, I believe, with a little bit of dismay, like, what, we weren't looking at evidence before? When in fact, evidence takes on many forms. But the evidence-based or science-based or movements had suggested that there were ways in which experimental evidence and theoretical theories about learning, theories about genetics, for example, could have a bigger impact in the actual practice of medicine. And I think that there are some lessons, perhaps, about the parallel movement in evidence-based educational practices that we might draw from looking at what went on in some of the features of evidence-based medicine. So this is the quote that everybody appeals to, that what is evidence-based medicine? The conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions. And in the What Works Clearinghouse, which probably most of you know about, they adopt a very similar kind of rhetorical framework. It's an initiative that the goal is to promote informed education decision-making by providing educators, policymakers, researchers, and the public with a central and trusted source of scientific evidence about what works in education. And so there's this emphasis on evidence, which immediately is a welcome call to a philosopher of science, since that's the kind of thing we wander around in. What counts as evidence? What are the challenges of getting good evidence? And what are the shortcomings of different methods for getting them? So you might think that there are kind of two components to this approach of evidence-based X, right? One is, what is the best evidence for what works? How do we get good evidence for what's going to work in the classroom or in the doctor's office? Which intervention, medically or educationally, will produce the desired results, right? What are the causal factors that increase health or learning, right? Again, trying to draw this parallel. And what factors contribute to the failure, right? Disease or lack of learning. What are the features that either a physician can use, drugs, surgeries, right? Lifestyle interventions, or a teacher can use in the classroom that will help achieve their goals, right? Better health, better learning, right? And so to do that, there are theories about what makes healthy bodies, what causes disease, what makes a student able to learn better, what causes them to fail. That scientific understanding can inform the clinician on the forefront of practice to make better decisions in that domain. So this all seems very reasonable, but how does it actually work? So one thing for the science-based X to work is that you have to have a way of getting good evidence, okay, first of all. But that's not the end of the story. You also have to be able to take what counts as good evidence for what causes a particular disease, for example, and say when, where, and how will it work in an application. So you have to take the theoretical and experimental and scientifically derived information and say, okay, here's how I can get evidence about what causes early onset Alzheimer's or what causes schizophrenia, right? What are the genetic components? I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you have to say, well, now that I've got information like that, how can I translate that into practice? So when can what works in one context, for example, in an experiment or in an in vivo, in a life study of one individual or one classroom, how can I take what works there, which I can get scientific evidence for, and apply it to other contexts? Sometimes That's called the problem of external validity. How can I take what I create a context where I can learn what the factors are cleanly and clearly, but then how does it apply outside of that context? So what I would like to suggest is that there's challenges to both sides to both pieces of that project, both getting the evidence and exporting it from one context to another. There are challenges that come from the complexity of the system you're studying. If everything was nice and simple, if every event had a single powerful cause and nothing, and it always had that cause, right? So if in fact every time you drop a ball, let's just do basic Newtonian physics here for a minute. Every time you drop a ball on the Earth, it falls with the same acceleration. And it doesn't matter if you're in Palo Alto or in Pittsburgh or in San Diego or in many of the other places that we've all been in. It doesn't matter to those contexts where you go. It's always going to have the same effect, right? And it doesn't matter if what you drop is painted blue or painted green or painted purple. None of that matters. It's a very stable causal relationship between effects, between causes and effects that has no, context changes don't matter very much at all. But complex causality, and so when you study it and you learn about it, I can study and do my experiment here in Palo Alto, and I can tell people all over the planet that this will work for them too, as long as there's no confounding factors, right? Then that's really nice. I can export that very easily. But when I'm studying complex causal structures, I don't have that. It's not such an easy story. And so there's certain things that contribute to trying to do this kind of scientific evidence-based approach that complexity makes more difficult. And the reasons have to do with what makes things complex. So complex causality are situations where there's multiple contributing causes at multiple levels of organization. So it's not just the gene in a disease, but it's also the diet and the social and economic class and the other kinds of systems in the body. There's things going on at the cell level, at the organ level, at the whole system level. All of these different things contribute to whether somebody has a certain health problem or not. So there's multiple causes, and they all contribute to producing an effect. There's not just one thing to find. There's interactions amongst the causes. Namely, there's things like self-organization, feedback systems, right? So you get amplification effects, or you get inhibition or excitation or robustness in systems where you get, it's not just for a quick example, I don't want to use up too much of my time here. So in the case of psychiatric genetics, it was discovered that there was a gene that contributed to adults getting major depressive disorder, but it only contributed if they had simultaneously negative childhood experiences or childhood traumas. Just having the gene alone wasn't enough to predict this disease. Not having the childhood trauma alone wasn't enough to predict they'd have the disease, but there's an interaction between this environmental factor and the genetic factor, and that interaction was having both of those things was predictive of adults suffering from this disorder. So there are interactions between causes that make the study of what causes something to occur much more difficult. And then there's also context sensitivity. The contributions of what are non-modeled causes, what happens, what can't I replicate a study I've done in one context in another? Well, there's things I didn't take into account in the two cases that are contributing to what the effect is going to be. And there's chaotic consequences of sensitivity to initial conditions, which I'm not going to talk about, but maybe Jay will, but maybe not. So you can have these issues about how finding, if you want to use science, you have to, and you want to find out what to intervene on to make a better outcome, you have to find out what causes what. And if you're looking at what causes what in a complex context, that raises a number of different problems for realizing the dream of science-based or evidence-based X. So there are scientific approaches to detecting causal relations. Some of them, I'm sure there's science teachers amongst you who can give the lecture in your sleep about how to do this, right? And one of what was taken, especially in the evidence-based medicine tradition, as the gold standard that's always attached to that language, right? The gold standard of evidence is randomized control tests. And there's problems with randomized control tests when you apply them, when you want to use them as the only tool in which to probe complex systems to find out what causes what. And so, how do you get the best evidence? Well, the best evidence is when you can control for everything and vary just one factor and see what difference the effect has. And that turns out not to be an effective method in understanding or exploring complex causality. There's other ways, if you don't do experiments, of using statistics, there's a causal, I'm not going to talk about this either, but just to put it up there, there's causal Bayes nets inferences from statistical data. So from statistics, you could try to infer conditional probabilities, and from that you can try to generate causal models. And that kind of method, when you can't do experiments like in social science, right, difficult to do controlled experiments with human beings, that's another way of generating causal models, what causes what. But they also make assumptions about the nature of the system that they're studying, namely that they operate in a very linear way, that aren't satisfied by complex systems. And so these standard methods, what are taken the best interventionist experimental methods, and what's taken as what you can do when you can't experiment is the best method, fail to be very good tools for getting the best evidence when what you're studying is a complex system. So the problem is that there's multiple weak causes, there's feedback robustness and emergence. These are features of complexity that make these standard tools for what counts as the best, for generating the best evidence, less effective to do that. So I would give you an example of this, but so what do we do about that? So in the evidence-based medicine community, when people said, well, this doesn't work, so we shouldn't do evidence-based medicine. So it's like, use controlled experiments, or it's not real science, or it's not real evidence, right? And you're only given these two options. And anytime you're just given two options, my advice to you is be very worried, because there's something they're not telling you. There's always more than just this kind of, it's either this or it's that. And the story you're going to hear from me is that it's always more than one option, more than one way to play the game. But let me just explore for a second why randomized controlled tests are problematic for when you use them to apply to complex systems in biology. This is just a little illustration of genetic knockout experiments. And genetic knockout experiments are designed really to replicate the perfect controlled experiments where you knock out or snip out one part of a genome, right? You want to know what does this gene cause in the organism? What's it doing, right? You snip it out, and then if you're lucky, you can, the mouse doesn't die, right? And if you're even luckier, it'll breed with another mouse that you've snipped the same gene out of. And then you can produce these the mouse with a contribution from both the embryo with the snip and the sperm with the snip, right? And you can create these double copied mutants, right? And you can say, okay, now I have a mouse, a real living system, right? Identical in every way to my other mouse, except the one mouse has the normal genes, both copies, and the other one has in its place either nothing or something that negates the operation of that gene, okay? And what you're supposed to say is if you can get them, if they die, you know that that gene did something, but you don't know exactly what it did, right? But if, in fact, there's a big change between the double copied mutant and the normal, then you say that's what the gene does, right? Okay. And in fact, one of the developer, a co-developer of the knockout technique, Mario Capecci, who won the Nobel Prize for this, is really quite an amazing development in science, said, if you give me a gene, I could knock it out and tell you what its function is. Okay. So it's this kind of idea, the presumption that the normal function can be detected by getting rid of it and knocking it out. Now the problem is that about 30 to 40% of knockout experiments, holy moly, are you kidding? All right, 30% of knockout experiments leave you a fairly normal mouse, right? And there's no big change. And so one of the arguments is that what's happening when you intervene on one of those genes in a complex network is that the network reorganizes to compensate for the loss of that gene. And so doing single knockout experiments isn't going to give you that evidence. All right, so there's other forms of complexity. So controlled experiments have this problem, right, that they're not good at getting at those interactions. There's more complicated ways to do it, but those single knockouts aren't going to do it. The genetic causes influences on diseases, again, you can read this in psychiatric genetics, you can read this in cancer studies. Everybody's looking for the gene for X, right? And the gene for X is, if there is a single gene for X and it's the same in everybody, the one on the left side, right? Then everybody has one gene that's always associated with, say, early onset Alzheimer's, and everybody has the same bad gene when they get the disease. However, often what you get is there may be one gene, but it's a different gene for different people, right? And so you can't, again, once you discover one gene, you haven't discovered the causes of the disease, because other genes may do it in other individuals. These are two individuals, top and bottom. But even what's more complex is that now they've discovered that they're not getting the right kinds of studies about finding genes for diseases, and instead you get this whole array of multiple genetic factors that are associated with diseases. They're not just single, they're multiple, and they're not the same multiple constellation, they're variant. So how are we going to discover what's good evidence for what gene contributes what to what disease so that a physician can intervene in the right way? Well, there's been a move, and I'm going to try to go faster here. There's been a move from looking at these kinds of linkage or knockout or controlled experiments finding the gene to trying to find the patterns of genes that are associated with particular diseases. And this has been a move towards looking at big data mining through what's called genome-wide association studies. So they can look at the whole genome of all these people, millions and millions and millions of genes, and say, okay, here's the patterns of people who don't have the disease. Here's the patterns of people who do have the disease. What are the different associations of genes that I can detect from there? In complex traits, if there's a single large effect, knockout experiments can work. If there's lots of weak effects contributing to the outcome, you need to do something like association studies. All right, so one of the moves in evidence-based medicine of complexity is to do big data. Big data is going to solve it, right? Because now I can look at weak multiple causes and get some patterns of association with diseases. But are association studies enough, right? Well, all it tells you is when you have people with this disease, they have these patterns of genes, but they don't tell you what the genes do or how they produce the disease. So one thing about association studies is they identify genes that may explain differences, and the goal is to identify which collection of genes is associated with this disease. And I can look at your genome. Okay, 2 minutes. You can look at your genome, and I only have 3 more slides. Look at your genome and my genome and say, I predict that I'm more likely to have a disease than you, right? Okay, just by looking at this, right? Now I can make predictions on associations that aren't about what causes it. I can predict if you have more ashtrays in your house, you are more likely to be a smoker than somebody with fewer ashtrays in their house. But I'm not going to tell you anything about the causal process that generated it. And I guarantee if I go and remove the ashtrays, not going to change the probability of you getting lung cancer. So association studies can get at the patterns, but they can't get at the why. And so what one needs is to also, oh, you can't see this very well, understand the mechanism of disease and characterize its relevance in the bigger community. So even though some features of complexity can be, if you like, detected through these big data things, they're not it's not all we want to know. I may be able to predict who has the disease, but I can't know where to intervene to prevent them from having the disease, right? In a way that will help. 2 slides. How do we translate evidence? So evidence is hard to get, and the kind of system you're looking at changes the kinds of techniques that are going to give you any information, any usable information about them. And how are we going to get the information now? The best evidence is this pattern of genes are associated with this disease isn't going to tell you what to do, what the doctor what to do. And the question is, are there similar problems of complexity? That means I'm done, right? Similar problems of complexity in trying to do evidence-based instruction. So a recent paper by Ken Kettinger, Booth, and Clare called Instructional Complexity in Science and the Science to Constrain It in November in Science suggests that there are parallels with the evidence-based medicine I've been describing. Massive online experiments involve thousands of participants, vary many factors at once, etc. That's the kind of genome-wide association studies parallel. But a lab-derived principle may not scale to real courses because non-manipulated variables may change from lab to the real course. That means there's still a question of exporting. If you look at the mechanism in a particular case, how do you know that's going to be the same mechanism that occurs outside? So, last slide. When somebody says, here we should do evidence-based X, and the way to do it is to use the gold standard of controlled experiments, that's not the story. There are ways in which that's not going to be able to manage to get you the information that will be usable in your classroom, usable by your physician for your diseases. What you need to do is all of the above. It's not going to be a one or not, or this one or that one. Should we do big data, or should we do lab experiments? Should we do classroom experiments, or should we do big data association analysis? You need to do them both. They each show you some piece of the story, and none of them can show you the whole thing. So you need to couple all of those kinds of experiments in order to get at the information that's usable. Thank you.
Thanks very much for inviting me. And first of all, let me just tell you a tiny bit about who I am. I'm really an experimental psychologist. Most of my career has involved showing people stimuli that last for, maybe a 50th of a second, and looking at the response they make to those stimuli within about 700 milliseconds after that. So I call the work that we do looking at the microstructure of cognition. What goes on, in the tiny little details of a little thought process. Now, at a certain point in my career, I started to think more about learning-related issues, not just perception of brief stimuli. But often enough, we can study things that have to do with learning with relatively simple tasks where we get an answer pretty quickly. And I'm going to tell you about a task like that. But I'm going to use it to explore a question that I think is very, very important for us when we think about learning, which is, how do we get change to occur? How do we go from one way of thinking about something to a different level or stage of our cognitive abilities? This is a problem that has been studied over the years by psychologists for a very long time. Jean Piaget, who is sort of the founder of modern developmental psychology, or maybe the precursor, people would say now, believed that every experience that a child has affects their knowledge and abilities. But he also believed that our cognitive abilities involve discrete stages or levels of understanding. And so this poses a kind of a challenge, a question. So how do these small incremental changes that each experience leaves behind somehow lead us to be able to make, a developmental transition from one stage of thinking to another? Well, a colleague of mine at Carnegie Mellon studied this. some years ago now, using a domain that was first introduced by Piaget himself, namely the domain of asking kids to say which side of this scale would go down if it was free to move. And you can look at this yourself and see if you have an answer. We have 5 little weights, and you should know each of the 5 weights is exactly the same weight as every other one. We have 5 of these weights over here and 4 of them over here. Which side should go down? This is actually a challenge problem. It's a little bit harder than some. And most Carnegie Mellon undergraduates do not do particularly well with these kinds of problems. You should know. I'm not going to test you guys. I'm sure you'd all get it right. But Siegler's experiments were mostly about kids when they were considerably younger than that. And the striking thing about kids, let's say 5 to 9 years old, is that when they look at these problems, it appears, especially 5 or 6-year-olds, that they really only looking at the number of weights. The distance of the weights from the fulcrum has no impact whatsoever on their thinking. So you could give them a problem where there's one weight right next to the fulcrum on one side, and there's one weight way the heck out on the other side, and they'll just say that it balances. They're just paying attention to the amount of weight. This was what Siegler called Rule 1, and he talked about there being a dominant and a non-dominant dimension. In this problem, the dominant dimension is the weight, the distance being the non-dominant dimension. And the idea is if you're a Rule 1 kid, you ask yourself about the dominant dimension. If it's equal, you say they're equal or it balances. If they're not equal, you just say whichever is greater, that's the side that goes down. Okay, so it's very simple, one-dimension thinking. And then he said, well, and then, the next stage is where distance starts to begin to play a role. And in this stage, kids will respond on the basis of distance, but only if the weights are the same. Okay, so the rule becomes a bit more complex. If the dominant dimensions are equal, then you consider the subordinate dimension. Otherwise, you just go with the dominant dimension. So that's Rule 1 or Stage 1, Rule 2 or Stage 2. And so the findings here are that children who are 5 to 7 years old generally behave in accordance with Rule 1. Secondly, around the time they're 7 or 8, they're briefly consistent with Rule 2. It's a relatively short phase. And then when they get a little bit older, they start using more complex strategies. I don't have time to go into those today, but so we'll talk mostly about this transition into Rule 2. But it itself is sort of transitional. And another thing that is worth knowing is around the time of these transitions into Rule 2 and then beyond, children start to exhibit increasing, we might say, graded sensitivity to the distance cue. So that problem that I mentioned before, where the weight was really close to the fulcrum on one side and really far from it on the other side, where they might say, oh, gee, in that case, maybe this side will go down. But if the discrepancy is not so big, they won't care about it. Okay, so they're showing a graded influence of this factor. So, that's what I said. Okay. So, my research has been about the possibility that underlying our cognitive abilities, maybe we can characterize them approximately in terms of rules, but underlyingly, there's something much more continuous, something impacted by each individual experience that gradually changes as we accumulate these experiences. This work is very much stimulated by this Piagetian idea that I mentioned before, but it also is a bit radical, or at least it was once, in saying that maybe we don't actually have any rules. Maybe what we have instead is a little neural network that sort of implements this sort of microstructure of cognition. And it has these connection weights in it. So these are like little continuous variables that allow an input to influence another thing, change its activation. These things have continuous valued activations, and it's a bit like a balance scale, really. You know, you put an input on a particular input unit, and it's got a sort of a graded tendency to influence each of the units inside the network, and they in turn have graded tendency to influence the other ones. So you can imagine you could wire this thing up, right? So that, let's say, the weight on the left and the weight on the right could influence the output of the network, but the distance wouldn't have any influence. Maybe we just put 0 connections over there, so it wouldn't have any effect at all. Okay? So that would be an implementation of Rule 1. And Rule 2 would be where, gee, these would maybe be pretty strong, and these would be just a little bit in there, just strong enough to, as it were, tip the balance when these were completely equal. Right? So that was my intuition. And I don't have time tonight to tell you about the inner details of the neural network model, but that's essentially how it works. So the knowledge in the model is implicit, it's in the connections among these little units. Experience with examples shapes the connections. So we present the network with a problem, which is, you know, an input that says, okay, there's 3 weights on the left side, 4 weights on the right side, the distance on the left is 3, and the difference on the right is 2. And we ask it to predict which side will go down using these continuous valued parameters. And then we tell it the correct answer. And we use what's called an error-correcting learning procedure to just make little tiny adjustments in the connection weights. Okay? So experience gradually teaches this thing. The network learns to become sensitive to weight and distance gradually through the accumulation of small changes. Now, we know that kids are for some reason more sensitive to weight than to distance. And I don't have a theory about why, but one way of capturing that in my model was simply to give the model more experience where the weights are varying than experiences where the distances are varying. Okay? That's fine. When I did that, that meant that it learned about the weight more quickly than it learned about the distance. Nothing magical about that at all. But the key thing is that it does go through a fairly extended phase in which it's kind of like learned about the weight, but it's still learning about the distance. This is a continuous measure of the strength of the network, essentially. It just gives you an intuition of that. As it's going through repeated training examples. So this is like that Piagetian example of the flux of experience gradually producing changes which accumulate in your cognitive system and leave you with the ability to perform various judgment tasks, like saying which side of the scale will go down. So we were able to model all of the data from Bob Siegler's experiments with this simple model. Even though it's continuous, when we score it by giving it the same test that he gave kids, it always fits into one rule or the other, and that turned out to be pretty nice. Okay, I haven't got too much more time, but I do want to tell you about a little experiment, and I'm telling you this because it's the kind of thing you could imagine doing in a digitally enabled educational environment. And you're even going to see the intervention here yourselves, and you could imagine being the subject in the experiment. So I'm going to show you that. But first, I have to tell you a little bit about this pushback I got on my model. These dynamical systems guys in Holland saying, well, you know, there's something more to these rules that McClellan's model is telling us. The transitions are a bit more discrete. It's kind of like, you know, water going from solid to liquid. It's like, it's like a block when the temperature is -5 and -4 and -3. And when it gets to 0, it goes through a transition, and everything above that, it's just water, right? So there's really something discontinuous, and you're just not capturing it, man. So get over it. So they did an experiment to try to prove that I was wrong about this. And they looked for signs of these transitions, right? These catastrophes or jumps. And so they gave kids a little pretest to assess what they knew before they did their intervention. Then they gave them a series of distance problems, and I'll tell you exactly what I mean in a second. And then they gave them a post-test to see what impact that might have had. And they tested 300 children in this. They did it all with pencil and paper, but we can imagine we could have done that in 15 minutes this afternoon on the web, right? So here's the intervention. The kid sees a problem like this, and they're asked, left side, right side, or balance. Okay, so the kid gives an answer. Now, they don't get any feedback in this experiment. This is very important. So they give their answer, and then they get the next one. Left side, right side, or balance. Left side, right side, or balance. Goes all the way out to there, and then they come back down. Okay, so they're looking for this idea that, if there's a catastrophe or a sudden transition, they might push the kid over the edge at some point. The kid is has this sensitivity to this cue, but not very much, right? So you've got to get it over the edge, and now boom, okay, now the kid thinks, oh yeah, distance is important now. It should stick, right? A sudden jump in the mind of the child. So it should stick and persist as you come back down until you get back to here, where you should say balance again, of course. All right, so I'm almost out of time. But basically the idea is that kids should show either, they should get all of these kinds of distance problems wrong, which would be this bar of this graph. I'm not explaining the details fully. Or they should get all of them right, which would be this bar of the graph, and they shouldn't. There's some other problems that count for 0 and 5, but they shouldn't be in this intermediate range much, so they should show this binariness or an inaccessible region here. And from the pretest to the post-test, they should go from being here to over there. And then, furthermore, during the intervention itself, we should see things like this jump. As we go from a distance of 1 to 2, suddenly maybe at 3, they'd get it, and they'd hang up there. That would be a sudden jump. We might see other patterns, though. It might be when we came back down, they'd kind of hang on a little bit, but they still wouldn't believe it when it was just a smaller distance. So that's called a hysteresis pattern. A little bit of persistence, but not much. And then the Maxwell pattern is just when it's completely symmetrical. They have a fixed belief that it just takes that much extra distance to produce this effect. So when you come back down, no, that won't do it. All right, anyway, the findings of the experiment were that it was kind of like there was an inaccessible region, but there were some people in the middle. And when you went from the pretest to the post-test, it looked like there might have been a jump, but really, most of these people went into here, and most of the people who ended up here came out of the trough. And when you looked at these patterns, there were some who showed a jump, some who showed no change at all, and others who showed these other two patterns. So I can do this same experiment with my people. And the key thing we need, though, is something, how do you teach yourself? So usually we gave the network feedback. Now we have this idea, well, let's just suppose that when whatever your knowledge system is, it gives you an answer, you say, oh, well, maybe that's the right answer. And so you kind of reinforce your own tendency to give that answer. So we taught the network with its own responses. And when we did that, it gave it a chance to, once it got over the hump, it could progress from just having observed its own sense that this must be the right answer. So we did that, we introduced that idea, and then we also just put a tiny bit of randomness in the model. So it wouldn't be completely deterministic in its behavior, which of course is a basic aspect of human behavior. We are all just a tiny bit chaotic, I think, in random in our behavior. And we replicated the patterns quite well, I would say, qualitatively. We got all the same characteristics. We have slightly fewer jumps and maybe slightly more Maxwell's than they had before, but we capture the whole pattern of these kinds of changes with this very simple little model. So, let me conclude, because I know I must be well out of time right now. We're far from a perfect understanding of transitions in learning. But I feel like we have come a certain distance, right? Instead of just characterizing the knowledge state of the child in these discrete rules, we can actually sort of say, there may be something underlyingly that's more continuous, more subject to accumulation of knowledge, something like the neural networks in your brain, which goes beyond what the rule-based models can capture and gives us a way of being sensitive to the dynamics that occur in experience. So models with learning dynamics capture quite a lot more. They show gradual knowledge accumulation and patterns of change similar to what we see in children. And I've recently become interested. The reason I got to know our organizer here is because Candace was because I had approached her about getting involved in doing some online learning. I'd like to take these ideas into that context and see if we can use what we'll get out of the web to help us advance these ideas. So thank you very much.
All right. Is this on? Am I good to go?
Yes.
All right. And how do I make it go to the next slide? I push a button. Okay, good. It works. I'm going to speak, a little bit about why. I guess I should have gone first. I'm going to speak from the point of view of a computer scientist, and wow, this learning stuff is pretty simple, and it's just a matter of scale. That's something we know about in computer science. You want more stuff, we put it on the web, it's free, everybody wins. I mean, computer science really is about scale. So a computer is a vast, huge, complicated collection of very, very simple things. We know about positive charge or lack of charge, and we know how to make little circuit gates that combine 2 zeros and 1s and give you another 0, 1 based on them. But somehow putting lots and lots and lots of them together gives you something that's qualitatively different than 0s and 1s and, giving you a shock and stuff like that. Software systems are vastly, vastly complicated. And I think we as computer scientists believe that the most complicated artifacts ever constructed by humans are our current software systems. And somehow, I think one piece of evidence that we've been extremely successful in the field of computer science, and particularly in software, is that every interesting, complicated thing is built by 7 people who stay up late and go out for espresso about midnight. So how is it that 7 people now can build something vastly more complicated than 7 people could have done a decade ago? And they were much more effective in building complicated software systems than people a decade before. It's by somehow understanding how to put together complex ideas into libraries or reusable pieces of software that a small number of people who load all the details into their head temporarily, under the influence of lots of caffeine or something like that, are able to put something together. Similarly, networking, pretty simple idea. You can connect 2 computers together, they communicate. Connect all of them together, they communicate. Pretty simple thing. So internet is really just a matter of scale, taking a really simple idea and replicating it. So I think when we in my department heard that you needed more education, I think we heard that about 3 or 4 years ago. We thought this was going to be a pretty simple thing. We looked back at our own education. What did I do when I was a student? Went, fell asleep in lecture, went home, tried to figure out what the person said, wrote it up for homework, went back the next day, did the same thing. So we took lectures on video, let you fall asleep in front of your computer, ask you a few homework questions, let you figure out what happened, go on. So it should have been a pretty easy thing. And it's a little bit surprising that it's more complicated. But on the other hand, we like complexity, we like problems, we like stuff to solve. So actually, we're pretty happy. So this is just a bar chart showing some amount of stuff going on campus. All interesting charts go up and to the right. This one shows the lower bar, the number of on-campus courses that are using web technology to deliver a portion of the course is going up to the right. Many more in fall 2013 than fall 2012. About 100 different faculty have worked with our group and others like us across campus to experiment with putting things on the web over the last couple of years, and others did that before. And the number of public courses, this just, I don't know why there's none on fall 2012, the number of public courses that we make available at scale to tens or hundreds of thousands of people is also, increasing in some way. And I think over the past 2 years, if I have the number approximately right, almost 2 million people external to campus have signed up and participated to some degree. Maybe signing up is participation. Signed up and considered participating, and some of them actually have, with some free online course developed by Stanford. So that shows there's a massive interest in at least signing up for and not attending college class. So what else is new, right? But this does provide an occasion to collect data, and we're hoping we can work with that in productive ways. I think the closest analog really from recent computer science success has to do with advertising. At least that's what comes to mind. The world of advertising has been radically changed on the web from what it was like in television. If you can track what people do online, you can, if you're a website, auction off a little bit of screen real estate to the highest advertising bidder, giving a lot of information about the viewer for the advertiser to decide how much they want to pay to show you a picture of shoes or something like that. A lot of analytics and data analysis of real-time data capture and very rapid data processing goes into the millions or perhaps billions of things literally that happen when you load a web page and somebody buys that little corner of the screen that shows you an advertisement. So we could think that it's possible to gather data in the same way we gather data in advertising. You can see what someone does online or in a digital environment, what they pay attention to, what they click on, how long they pause, where their attention goes, what they do before and after, and so on. And we could try to figure out things like, what was someone's goal in signing up for this experience? I think if you want to say, was an activity successful, you really should think about that in connection with what someone's goal was in the first place. So if we can figure that out from the data, we can begin to evaluate whether things are successful or not. An interesting thing that's related to this is we've been trying to look at when someone is getting tired or about to disengage from an online experience. So that I think would be very hard to figure out if you had 30 people following your blog and occasionally clicking in. You just don't have enough data to see meaningful patterns and figure out what's going on. But you have a lot of people, you can begin to cluster the data and divide it into categories, some of which you can use meaningfully and some of which maybe you can't. And the evidence so far is really kind of simple, But it turns out we can predict for half the people that disengage that they're about to do so, maybe on the order of a week or 2 weeks, depending on the scale of activities before they do that. So that's useful. If you know someone's about to give up on something you think that they actually wanted to do, you can try to help them out in various ways and hopefully not offend them in doing that, but send them a message that's encouraging and helpful. Now, why does that work? Turns out some people are very regular in their approach to material. And when people are very regular and they deviate from their regular pattern, you know something is wrong, or at least something is up. And that's the group for which we can predict they're about to disengage. Some other people are completely sporadic and chaotic in their personal lives. They look at something they're interested in at random times of the day or night, and they can have arbitrary pauses between reading about one thing and reading about the next. For that group of people, we can't help them because their normal behavior when they're continuing something looks an awful lot like the behavior of somebody who's about to give up. But still, we can, for a large number of people, based on large-scale data analysis, figure something out. This is a chart that maybe I've shown to some of you before, some of you have seen. This is just another kind of example of data analysis. This is looking at people following an online video of a lecture, and they back up. The dark colors here indicate that a large number of people are backing up. So we can see a pattern here with a large number of people that you wouldn't have been able to see very clearly if they were 20 or 30. And from this, by doing some other correlation with how these people did on quiz questions that follow, we can figure out the group that was looking for something didn't do very well on question number 3, so that's apparently what they were looking for. The people B, who didn't watch the video, did just fine. So the people who were looking for the video, looking for an answer to a question, couldn't find it, indicate that whoever gave this lecture didn't cover what was in question 3, and you'd go back to them and say, make your material better. So I think by analyzing data, we can not just figure out characteristics of the learners and the community involved, but also give data back about that. I thought this is also interesting in scale. I think the two things that are important about scale for this area are, one, just massive amounts of data make it easier to see patterns and draw conclusions than small amounts of data would. And the other is, you have a lot of people participating in something. Maybe they can help each other. So what can we do along that line to achieve results at scale based on the scale? And this is a picture of a peer grading. It's for a design-oriented course in which one of the topics of the course is to evaluate the designs of other people, understand what a good design looks like. And so it's a perfectly good part of the course, a valuable part of that, to help the people participating to understand how to evaluate other designs that they didn't write, work of others. And so peer grading really fits into the goal of the learning experience. And by feeding this with, a little bit complicated, just sort of wave my hands at, you put in some assignments that you know the answer, how good the grade should be. You ask a lot of people to grade that, and you get calibrated on the people who graded the exams or assignments which you knew the quality of. You get some calibration of how reliable they are, and whether they're biased positively or negatively. And from that, you can, by data analysis, correct the scores that each student gets and make them more reliable. So here's an example of using data analysis at a large scale to kind of correct for noise and potential errors in the input to a grading process. And I think that's encouraging. It means we can do better in the future with peer grading. And finally, this is a little bit subtle, but it appears in some sense, at least for this example and some others, that if you have lots and lots of people, you still don't get lots and lots of different answers to relatively systematic kinds of questions. So these are simple computer programs written in response to a machine learning problem set. They cluster into about 5 big groups of very similar sorts of answers. So you could try to, if you were a person running a large learning experience at scale, you could try to find the big clusters and then by hand, pick one from each of the cluster and write something back and help people out that way. I think that's promising. And it turns out we can not only cluster things like solutions to problems, but by instrumenting a development or problem-solving environment online, you can cluster the stages that individuals go through as they solve problems, and not just find that there are not that many solutions that people find, if you have an arbitrary number of people, but there are not that many different problem-solving processes that are observable in many cases. And you can try to give feedback on that. Something that ties in with something Jay observed, which I thought was interesting, is that here in this particular experiment, what we found was that the problem-solving approach that an individual followed wasn't very useful in predicting the score of that individual on the homework. And the reason is that the people who worked at it solved the problem and eventually got good scores. But the people who had poor or less effective problem-solving approaches did poorly later in the course because they really didn't have as effective a way, it appears, of addressing problems. So these are just examples of large amounts of data being useful to determine things that would have not been visible otherwise. And just to kind of conclude on the tongue-in-cheek but partly meaningful idea that this is really just a computer science problem, I thought I'd put up the recently announced program for the Learning at Scale conference, which is a computer science conference looking at problems and ideas related to offering educational experiences at web scale. So these, I won't really go through all these, but they're looking at different kinds of effectiveness. How much do skill improvement in different kinds of MOOCs? When do people drop out? How important is a good teacher? Does it matter at all? Are hints effective or not? The last paper says hints get in the way and confuse people. Probably has something to do with a kind of hints. We're just computer scientists. We didn't do a good job on hinting. Does the quality of the professor matter? Different kinds of clustering, and then behavior in the social networking part of it, the discussion portion. And I think for many of the courses, what we've seen from our data is that there's not as much participation in the discussion part of a course as we might hope. Our current model doesn't really do as well as we would like, but in the future we will see if we can do better on engagement or if there are different ways of structuring courses to do that. So there's a lot of, I just want to throw out some ideas, give some sense of what the interest is in this topic area from a computer scientist, and now we'll have a discussion and hopefully that'll be entertaining as well. Thanks.
Okay, so I thought I would start us off with a question and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So I guess I want to start with this last question about big data, because I'm sure you've all read in the news that big data is now becoming a big core part of doing learning research, and that big data is going to essentially solve the woes we've had of educational challenges for decades. So I want to just turn to our panelists and ask, what does, given that learning is a complex system, what does big data give us power to do that we didn't have, for example, in the days when Jay was doing his research? So what's the power of big data?
Big.
Nothing, John, so you can detect patterns, right? When you have a lot of data points that you couldn't see with 1 or 2 or 300, right? So you can see more patterns and clusters, and they may be indicative of something that has some real causal influence. That you can use it to, if you have no hypothesis about what the data is going to look like in the first place, right? You can use it to generate hypotheses that you could then go study later. I think that's the story from the genome-wide association studies. I see these patterns, there's something there, right? But what is it? And then you have to do some other kind of analysis than just the kind of associations in that kind of big data study.
One of the things, I work with neural networks, as I described, but some of my colleagues work with really big neural networks, and some of those neural networks they work with are the ones that are now understanding your voice when you tell your Android phone that you want to get pizza somewhere in Mountain View tomorrow. And the fact that they're able to train these networks with massive quantities of data means that they're able to really separate out the wheat from the chaff in terms of the signals that are present in the data, right? And this is very important for those interactions that you were talking about. There are subtle interactions in the way we say various words that the computer needs to infer in order to be able to do a good job. But if it's only gotten 1 or 2 examples of that, it can't tell the difference between the signal and the noise, right? So the massive data sets are become increasingly more and more necessary as you get to the point of having more and more subtle little causal factors that are really relevant. And it's not as clear to me. I guess those of you who've been in education for longer, I would ask this question. It's almost not as clear to me that the message we're trying to get across to our students, is as complex as what the subtle cues are in the speech stream, right? So it might even not be as hard of a problem sometimes to use that data from specific kinds of things we're trying to teach people, like how to take a derivative or understand the central limit theorem. I don't know.
So
you can ask somebody who's an educator.
So then I guess the question is, then are the computer scientists going to solve it all? Is there any shortcoming of just using big data as the silver bullet for solving the complex system of teaching and learning?
Let me make 2 quick comments. One, I think big data refers not only to a large number of individuals, but maybe a lot of information per individual. So we now collect a lot more information about someone's behavior in various ways than we would have ever before. And so there's more information per individual. On your question of where is computer science, what can computer scientists do? I think one of the great pleasures of the last year and a half or so in trying to look at building up research questions and research group and get student activity going and so on has been the kind of interdisciplinary nature of the field. So it's easy to get a lot of data and throw a machine learning algorithm at it and predict something. But it helps to speak with someone with some subtlety and understanding of what you'd like to predict in order to use those kind of algorithms and data processing methods effectively.
So
Wait,
go ahead. So we have a microphone here. I'm going to ask
and
Ms.
you need to
Mitchell's going to
stand up and you need to say
say
who
who
you
you
are.
are, and then
Daniel Kapp, I'm a professor in radiation oncology, practicing oncologist. We know a lot about randomized controlled trials, and some of their biases. Still, they are the gold standard, as you mentioned. What I find continually missing year to year are randomized controlled trials testing the validity of your underlying assumption, not that people can learn online, but that can learn better online than in classroom. And in what situations, what courses, What students? So can you comment on that? Why aren't we doing more to answer a fundamental problem that I see lacking?
What's the fundamental problem on your view?
The fundamental problem is as far as I know, there are only 1 or 2 randomized controlled trials comparing online learning. These were studies from New Jersey compared to classroom learning, and the community colleges, the students did worse with online learning, not better. So it may work. We used to use the analogy, take a bright student from Stanford, put him in a closet, give him a computer, he's going to learn. I'm asking, what are the groups that you think will benefit the most from this, and are there groups that you think this approach won't work?
You want to take that, or?
Yeah, I think I'm probably the most qualified to
Well,
answer that
let's start
question.
with that. Yeah.
I'll step out of the role of moderator, because I'm the only education researcher here on the panel in that sense. So I think actually I would argue with the question, because the question you're asking is online better or is traditional face-to-face better?
And under what conditions?
So that's the actual question. The question is not which is better, and there seems to be the randomized control trials that people are trying to do are these horse races trying to argue which is better. And learning is a much more complex system. So the real questions we need to be asking are what are the multiplicity of factors, both in the context and in the intervention, that is going to produce what kind of learning outcome for what individual or group of students.
And are we studying that?
And are we what?
Are we studying that crucial question?
Yes, we are studying. I mean, that's I think the promise of these kinds of environments is being able to do realistic studies in real contexts, but be able to control or account for many of the variables.
So I guess I would say online learning is like a 4-year-old child at this point, right? I mean, it's something that's been happening for, you're shaking your head, but it burst onto the scene, right, as a major thing that people were doing relatively recently. When the Wright brothers, were first getting their plane off the ground, did they get 75 feet or something like this? There's a huge amount of that cycle that John was talking about that's got to, get played through a few more times before we really begin to have a sense of what the potential value of it is. The other thing that I would say is that I guess I've always liked this idea that there could be a tremendous benefit for having a certain part of the instruction being online with then opportunities for more targeted engagement, taking some of the burden off the TAs and just marking the homeworks to actually instead sit with the individuals who are having the problems for a longer time. Same total amount of time spent, but the machine offloads the part that's easy and then really says, okay, this guy really needs somebody to sit with them and work through this. So that complementarity is something I think we'll see really kick in. I'm guessing myself.
Hey, I'm Chris Proctor. I'm alumnus of STEP and currently a computer science teacher at all-girls middle school. And the question is mostly for former English teacher, for Jay, but maybe others when I comment too. There's a lot of research supporting when you're teaching reading and reading comprehension. What really distinguishes strong readers from weak readers is the extent to which they're paying attention to themselves as they read. And I'm curious, you must have had opportunities to sort of speculate on how you would model metacognition, thinking about yourself, attending to the way that you're attending to the task in a neural network. And I'm curious whether you can speculate on that.
Yeah, so one of my former students has made his career out of asking the question of how we come to be able to introspect about our own mental states, if indeed they are in fact things that are encoded in neural networks. And
Particularly where the knowledge is implicit.
exactly. So how do you even know what you know? And how do you reflect on it? I think my sense is that we have a long way to go in answering this question because we're still trying to understand cognition itself and thinking about cognition you know, that maybe that's where we'll get when we have those libraries well compiled. But what Axel does in his work is he actually imagines that you have another neural network that's learning to make predictions about the one that's actually doing the task. And he's been able to use that successfully to account for some of the kinds of things that we see in how metacognition itself is affected by task variables, things like that. So I don't really have an answer to your question yet, but I do have one former student who's working on it. So that's a good question. That's really good.
I have a question. First of all, spectacular, really great work. Thank you for your contributions. And this is a question for Sandra. How do we talk back to these randomized control trial people, because they are running the education science establishment in Washington, and they're having profound implications for the organization of education research nationally. So where do I start a conversation with those who believe the gold standard story?
That's a hard question to answer. I think at least my approach is to understand what controlled experiments do and do very well, and under what circumstances. This is to, reiterate other questions that come up. So for certain kinds of things, randomized controlled experiments are really good. And when they fail, the question is, why did they fail? What is it about was it a bad test, or was there no association to be found, or was there other reason that it was happening? And I think, so one answer is to not say, no, they're terrible, okay? So it's this dichotomous discourse, I think, that's getting everybody in trouble here. It's only controlled experiments. No, they can't work because we're talking about humans who have all this randomness in their behavior and updating, and they can't, you can't find anything out about them that way. But rather to try to partition the questions into what you can do that way and what other kinds of analysis you need to do. One of the problems with randomized controlled experiments is their exportability. If you create a system in a laboratory setting, right, where you have more control, because you get better results the more control you have. But the more control you have, the less like the natural setting you're going to be looking at. And so one of the problems is, how do I use what they can find out when I shift context? And there's some in vivo suggestions about how to do experiments in classrooms or in complicated systems, and try to do variations and then figure out how to export it. So it's to create a kind of hybrid of using what the logic behind randomized controlled experiments in a context where not all of those features can be satisfied. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lee Schneider. I also have a question for Sandra, essentially about bringing those systems together. The question about education is sort of what dimensions along education do you think connections can be made between these different kinds of evidence? But I'm not sure if maybe Candace can take that one as well. So there's that question, and there's this sort of larger question, meta question about the system that you see that allows those kinds of evidence coming together. Do you think we're having those conversations now, or if we're not having them, how can we start having them in a way that does bear on practice?
Well, I think everybody has to come to the same table as part of the problem. There isn't an algorithm for how to bring them together, but part of the question has to be.
We'll quote you on that.
Oh.
There is not an algorithm to bring people together.
Well, maybe John would like to.
Oh, but maybe the computer scientist could solve that. So the question is, when you want to do experiments, you want to find out what are the relevant variables to investigate, right? There's a parallel in medicine, but I won't go there. We call candidate genes. But you want to find out, you may have reason if you work in a classroom of saying, look, these are the things that seem to be good candidates for investigating further. So you can't have the people who are doing the experiments not have the insight of the person in the classroom, right? Because then they're going to be finding out things that aren't very relevant to your practice. So how you structure the problems, how you structure the experiments, have to be done in a kind of collaborative, interdisciplinary way. And I think, again, I don't know, I'm sort of ecumenical here. I think it's like we can all help each other, right? It's not that you have to do what I do, right? But what I do can help you do something that can then have further consequences on the field. So I think it's inviting everybody in and recognizing, again, the expertise, the different expertise they bring to the table in order to generate mutually informative kinds of associations. Candace, maybe you have more to say. That's great.
Yeah, my name is Harold Satan. I'm a visiting scholar with Stanford. Come from Norway, University of Bergen. Been teaching the old-fashioned way for I don't know how many decades, and my eyes are really popping out hearing about all these things. I have a couple of very simple questions. John Mitchell shows this graph of how online teaching has been expanding at Stanford. And I'm just wondering, I guess I'm around the question of the potential and the limits of this kind of new teaching. So first of all, you didn't have anything about what kind of subject is this. Can anything be subjected to these kind of online teaching systems, and particularly also at each level, from undergraduate level to maybe master's, PhD level, or whatever. So I was sort of wondering a little bit about these things, because the university is sort of, in the old-fashioned way, is a physical interaction between students and teachers. So I have some sort of horror visions of the time when we don't see each other, and maybe that's just exaggerated. So, thank you.
Well, I don't think video conference and telecommuting put the airlines out of business. We still fly places to see each other, and I don't expect online delivery and communication to make being face-to-face any less valuable, although there are a number of things you can do online that are effective when it's difficult to be in the same place, and also we can shift the time and place that people do some activities so that you free up time when you're in the same room for something that's most effective. As far as your questions about subject, I don't know that there's so much of a connection between the subject and the amenability to covering some portion of it online. It's more really has to do with what the professor wants to communicate and how they want to approach a class, and whether some part of it can be done in a large-scale fashion via video or other means. There are nice things besides video lectures that are also important, kinds of simulated environments that are good for students to carry out their own kind of personal experiments. Those would be difficult to do in a classroom kind of setting. In the biosciences, there are lots of videos of biological processes that are time-consuming and in fact not used in teaching, but we can make it available on the web for students who look outside class, and I think that's a good enhancement. So there has been greater uptake in the sciences and in some of the business-oriented and group project-oriented courses. I don't know if that's long-term going to be a meaningful distinction. The level, of course, I think there is more uniformity, that the faculty who've been interested in producing an externally visible online course to reach a large audience have primarily, I think, selected the courses that they think kind of identify their personal view of their field at a low enough level for there to be a broad audience for them. So that tends to be upper level, upper division undergraduate courses are one of the more common things, or beginning graduate kind of level courses. Although we have seen it at other levels also.
Yes.
Hi, Alice Fang. I'm an undergraduate. My question is for Professor McClellan. It piqued my interest what you said at the end about taking your research and applying it to online learning. I'm wondering if you meant more of just using this massive amount of data to build better models and to better understand how learning or teaching works, or whether you envision a way to use what we know about modeling and neural networks to actually improve the process of learning online.
I think definitely I'd like to do both. I certainly see an opportunity for both. As for myself, there's something that Candace is also very interested in that I find very exciting here, which is in part a response I have to the question that was asked before, and that is that we get the opportunity to create situations where we can get the student to kind of show their work as they solve the problem at the computer, and we can use the details of the steps that they take as they're solving a problem online to help us infer what the state of their thought processes are, and then to target the thing that we want to do to intervene. And for example, I can imagine with the little tests with the balance scale, for example, we can titrate a person and find out just how much distance they require in order for them to start being sensitive to that. And so we can imagine sort of like think, oh, okay, so you're not ready for this at all yet, for one particular student, and set this exercise aside. But we find another one who's beginning to be sensitive to that. And we could, then we could use the neural network to help us figure out, well, exactly which experiences should I give the neural network to make it progress, and then we'll do the same thing in the experiment that we're doing online, right? So this is very different from a lecturer talking for 20 minutes and then you answering a bunch of multiple choice questions afterwards. I'm sure that's not the only thing you were saying goes on there, but it's like, giving yourself a chance to watch the students sort of learn for themselves, right? Well, they're interacting with the problem, with the interface, with the various tools that we give them to try to solve the problem, and it just seems like that's a place where we have a way of making lots and lots of micro observations, collecting a lot of data about an individual, and then using all of that to really help us advance our effort to get this person the things that they need right now, given where they're at.
Okay, well, we've actually run out of time, so I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our speakers this evening. I'd also like to say, as I said, this is the first public forum of the quarter. The second public forum of the quarter will be on February 18th, which is another Tuesday evening, and that panel will be on identity, motivation, and stereotype threat. And the panelists on that will be our own dean, at least for the time being, of the Graduate School of Education, Claude Steele, Carol Dweck, Jeff Cohen, and Deborah Steinbeck.
Co-sponsored by the Stanford workshop on poverty, inequality, and education. So it should be a good crowd. Come again.
Thank you.